The auditorium at Georgetown University's Public Policy Institute was filled to capacity, with overflow crowds watching via livestream as Sarah Chen delivered the keynote address for the annual Conference on Institutional Accountability and Workplace Justice. Her transformation from uniformed military officer to civilian advocate had been remarkable, but the core of her identity remained unchanged: the same quiet authority, the same commitment to justice, the same willingness to speak difficult truths, regardless of personal cost. Institutional change is not a moment but a process, Sarah told the audience of academics, policymakers, and advocates. What happened at Naval Air Station Meridian was significant not because of the physical confrontation, but because it represented the breaking point where silence became more dangerous than speaking out, where institutional loyalty could no longer justify complicity in harm. Her civilian career had taken unexpected turns, beginning with a consulting position at a defense contractor that specialized in organizational development and cultural transformation. Her first-hand experience with military dysfunction, combined with her leadership expertise and communication skills, had made her valuable to organizations struggling with similar issues. But her real impact had come through advocacy work that extended far beyond military circles. The Sarah Chen Foundation, established 2 years after her discharge, focused on supporting individuals who challenged institutional dysfunction at personal cost: whistleblowers, victims of workplace harassment, professionals who chose principles over career security. The foundation provided legal support, financial assistance, and career transition services for people whose courage in speaking truth to power had come at professional cost. Dr. Amanda Foster had left active military service and joined the foundation as Director of Victim Services, bringing medical expertise and deep understanding of institutional trauma to support individuals recovering from workplace abuse. Her transition from treating the symptoms of systematic dysfunction to addressing its root causes represented the kind of career evolution that institutional accountability could enable. Sarah showed us that resistance was possible, Dr. Foster explained during the foundation fundraising event. But she also showed us that resistance required support systems, that individual courage needed institutional backing to create sustainable change. The foundation represents our attempt to provide that backing for others facing similar choices. The foundation's work had expanded beyond military issues to support civilian employees challenging corporate harassment, government workers exposing agency misconduct, academics confronting institutional bias, and healthcare professionals reporting patient safety violations. The common thread was individual courage in the face of systematic dysfunction, the willingness to accept personal cost for broader social good. Master Chief Rodriguez, now retired from active service, had become a frequent collaborator with the foundation while pursuing her own advocacy work through veterans organizations. Her perspective as a senior enlisted leader provided crucial credibility in military circles, while her experience during the Admiral Hartwell crisis gave her unique insight into institutional transformation processes. The changes we've seen in military culture didn't happen overnight, Rodriguez explained during a joint conference presentation with Sarah. They required sustained pressure from multiple directions, legal accountability, political oversight, media attention, and most importantly, internal advocacy from service members who refused to accept that harassment was inevitable. The statistics supported her assessment. Military sexual assault rates had declined significantly in the 5 years since Admiral Hartwell's conviction, driven by comprehensive reforms that address not just incident response but prevention through cultural change. Reporting rates had increased even as incident rates declined, suggesting that victims felt safer coming forward and that potential perpetrators understood that accountability was real. Lieutenant Morrison, now Commander Morrison, had been promoted ahead of his peers and assigned as executive officer of a guided missile destroyer, his career trajectory reflecting Institutional recognition that ethical leadership was valued alongside operational competence. His experience during the Admiral Hartwell crisis had become a case study in military ethics courses, demonstrating how junior officers could support institutional accountability without sacrificing their own careers. The lesson wasn't that resistance is always rewarded, Morrison explained during a Naval Academy ethics symposium. The lesson was that institutional integrity depends on individuals choosing to do the right thing regardless of personal consequences. Sarah Chen's courage created space for the rest of us to act ethically without facing the same impossible choices. His current assignment included responsibility for implementing cultural training programs designed to prevent harassment and create command climates where inappropriate behavior would be challenged immediately rather than tolerated and suppressed. The programs drew heavily on lessons learned from the Admiral Hartwell case, using concrete examples to illustrate both institutional failures and successful intervention strategies. 7 years later, the congressional hearing room was packed as lawmakers examined the effectiveness of military justice reforms implemented in response to the Admiral Hartwell case. Sarah Chen appeared as expert witness, her testimony providing perspective on both the progress that had been achieved and the work that remained to be done. The reforms have been significant and meaningful, Sarah testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Reporting mechanisms are more robust, investigation procedures are more independent, and accountability measures are more effective. But institutional culture changes slowly, and maintaining progress requires constant vigilance against backsliding. Senator Patricia Morrison, now chair of the full Armed Services Committee, used the hearing to highlight both successes and ongoing challenges in military justice reform. The legislation that bore Sarah's name had been implemented across all service branches, creating standardized approaches to harassment prevention and response that had significantly improved outcomes for victims. The Sarah Chen Act represents more than policy reform, Senator Morrison declared. It represents a fundamental shift in how military institutions approach the balance between loyalty and accountability, between protecting institutional reputation and protecting the people who serve within institutions. The hearing featured testimony from current service members who had benefited from the reforms, demonstrating that the changes had real impact on individual lives and career experiences. Young female officers spoke about serving in environments where harassment was addressed promptly and effectively, where career advancement was based on merit rather than social compliance, where speaking out was supported rather than punished. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, now a senior enlisted advisor at Navy Personnel Command, testified about her role in implementing cultural training programs that had emerged from the Admiral Hartwell case. Her career had recovered and flourished after the reforms created space for her professional competence to be recognized rather than overshadowed by her history as a harassment victim. The changes didn't just protect future victims, Santos testified. They created opportunities for people like me to contribute to solutions rather than just surviving problems. My experience with harassment became qualification for helping prevent it from happening to others, rather than career liability that had to be hidden. Her testimony illustrated one of the most significant outcomes of the institutional accountability movement: the transformation of victim experience into advocacy expertise. The recognition that people who had survived institutional dysfunction possessed valuable insight into preventing it. The documentary film crew followed Sarah through her daily routine at the Foundation's headquarters in Washington, D.C., capturing the quiet intensity that had characterized her entire career. Breaking Point, the Sarah Chen story, would premiere at the Sundance Film Festival the following month, bringing the Admiral Hartwell case to broader public attention while examining broader questions about institutional accountability and individual resistance. "I never intended to become a symbol," Sarah told the documentary director during a reflective interview. "I was just trying to do my job, protect my people, and serve with integrity. The confrontation with Admiral Hartwell was self-defense, not activism. The activism came later, when I realized that individual resistance needed to be channeled into systematic change. The Foundation had grown into a significant force in institutional reform movements, with offices in 12 cities and staff members who brought expertise from military service, corporate leadership, government employment, and academic research. The organization's influence extended far beyond individual case support to include policy advocacy, research initiatives, and cultural transformation programs. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Master Chief Rodriguez's daughter, had joined the Foundation staff after completing her doctorate in organizational psychology. Her research focused on cultural change and hierarchical institutions. Her academic work built on her mother's practical experience while bringing theoretical frameworks that enhanced the Foundation's effectiveness in analyzing and addressing institutional dysfunction. My mother's experience during the Admiral Hartwell crisis shaped my entire academic career, Dr. Rodriguez explained. I wanted to understand the psychological and sociological factors that enable institutional abuse, and more importantly, the factors that enable institutional transformation. Sarah's resistance created a case study that has influenced my research for 15 years. Her work had contributed to understanding how individual acts of resistance could catalyze broader cultural change, how institutional accountability could be maintained over time, and how organizations could build resilience against the kind of systematic dysfunction that had characterized military culture before the reforms. The Naval Academy's new Center for Leadership and Ethics was dedicated in a ceremony that brought together military leaders, congressional representatives, and advocates who had contributed to institutional transformation over the previous decade and a half. Sarah Chen was invited to deliver the dedication address, her first formal return to military environment since her discharge years earlier. Leadership without accountability is not leadership but dominance, Sarah told the assembled midshipmen and faculty. The center we dedicate today represents institutional commitment to ensuring that future military leaders understand the difference between authority and authoritarianism, between loyalty and complicity, between institutional protection and institutional integrity. The center would house research programs, teaching initiatives, and practical training designed to ensure that future military officers understood both the privileges and responsibilities of leadership. The curriculum drew heavily on case studies from the Admiral Hartwell crisis and similar incidents, using concrete examples to illustrate ethical principles and practical applications. Admiral Patricia Williams, now Chief of Naval Operations and the first woman to hold that position, spoke about the cultural transformation that had made her own advancement possible. Her career had flourished in the post-Hartwell environment, where competence rather than political reliability had become the primary criterion for senior leadership positions. Commander Chen's courage 15 years ago created opportunities for all of us, Admiral Williams declared. Not just opportunities for women, but opportunities for ethical leadership to flourish in environments where integrity is valued over loyalty, where speaking truth to power is rewarded rather than punished. Williams's promotion to the Navy's highest position had been part of broader changes in military leadership selection that emphasized character alongside competence, cultural transformation alongside operational effectiveness. The reforms had created space for diverse perspectives in senior leadership, while maintaining the high standards that military effectiveness required. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres, now Captain Torres and commanding officer of a guided missile cruiser, attended the ceremony with several of her female officers, representing the generation that had benefited most directly from the institutional changes. Her career trajectory illustrated how the removal of harassment and discrimination had allowed merit-based advancement to function effectively. I never experienced the kind of systematic harassment that previous generations faced, Captain Torres explained to a journalist covering the ceremony. Not because the problem disappeared overnight, but because the reforms created mechanisms for addressing it quickly and effectively. The culture shifted from tolerating inappropriate behavior to preventing it. Her command had become a model for inclusive leadership and cultural excellence, demonstrating that institutional accountability enhanced rather than diminished military effectiveness. The crew's performance metrics reflected the benefits of diverse leadership and cultural climates where all personnel could contribute without fear of harassment or discrimination. The retirement community in Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains provided the peaceful setting where Sarah Chen spent her mornings, writing memoirs that would provide historical perspective on institutional transformation movements of the early 21st century. Her book, Breaking Silence: Leadership, Accountability, and the Cost of Change, had become required reading in business schools, public policy programs, and military academies around the world. The confrontation with Admiral Hartwell lasted 30 seconds, Sarah wrote in her introduction. The institutional transformation it catalyzed has taken decades and will require constant maintenance for generations. Individual acts of resistance matter not because they solve problems immediately, but because they create opportunities for sustained efforts to address systematic dysfunction. Her daily routine included correspondence with individuals facing similar choices in their own institutions, corporate whistleblowers, government employees reporting misconduct, healthcare workers challenging dangerous practices, academics confronting institutional bias. The advice she offered drew on decades of experience navigating the intersection between individual conscience and institutional power. The foundation she had established continued operating under new leadership, with Dr. Rodriguez serving as executive director while maintaining the original mission of supporting individuals who challenged institutional dysfunction at personal cost. The organization had evolved beyond crisis response to focus on prevention through cultural transformation and leadership development. Master Chief Rodriguez, now in her 80s, remained active in veterans advocacy despite retirement from formal organizational roles. Her memoir, Standing Watch: A Senior Enlisted Perspective on Military Transformation, provided complementary perspective to Sarah's account while emphasizing the crucial role that enlisted leadership played in cultural change. Officers like Sarah Chen provided the catalyst for change, Rodriguez had written. But sustaining that change required enlisted personnel who understood that following orders didn't mean abandoning moral judgment, that loyalty to institution meant protecting it from leaders who would corrupt its mission. Her analysis emphasized that institutional accountability required participation across all organizational levels, that cultural transformation could not be imposed from above but had to be embraced throughout hierarchical structures. The success of military reforms had depended on enlisted personnel who chose ethical behavior over convenient compliance. The memorial service for Admiral Marcus Hartwell, who had died in federal prison after serving 8 years of his 10-year sentence, was attended by a small group of family members and former colleagues who had maintained personal relationships despite his criminal conviction. The service provided opportunity for reflection on the complex legacy of his case and its continuing impact on military culture. Sarah Chen did not attend the service, understanding that her presence would distract from whatever healing the family needed while providing no benefit to broader accountability efforts. But she issued a brief statement through the foundation, acknowledging Hartwell's death and emphasizing the ongoing importance of institutional vigilance. Admiral Hartwell's death marks the end of an individual story, but not the conclusion of institutional transformation efforts, her statement read. The accountability measures implemented after his conviction must be maintained and strengthened to ensure that future generations of military leaders understand both the privileges and responsibilities of command authority. The statement reflected Sarah's consistent approach throughout her advocacy career, focusing on systematic issues rather than personal animosity, emphasizing institutional transformation over individual punishment, maintaining perspective that extended beyond immediate circumstances to long-term cultural change. Dr. Amanda Foster, now Director Emeritus of Victim Services at the Sarah Chen Foundation, used Hartwell's death as opportunity to examine the effectiveness of accountability measures implemented over the previous quarter century. Her analysis showed significant improvements in military culture while identifying areas where continued vigilance was necessary. The reforms worked, Dr. Foster concluded in her assessment. Military sexual assault rates declined, reporting increased, accountability improved, and cultural indicators showed sustained positive change. But institutional memory is fragile, and maintaining progress requires constant attention to leadership selection, cultural training, and accountability mechanisms. Her analysis emphasized that institutional transformation required generational commitment rather than single-moment reform, that the success achieved over 25 years could be lost quickly if vigilance relaxed or accountability measures were weakened by complacency. The final chapter of Sarah Chen's memoirs was completed in the same mountain retreat where she had spent her retirement years, surrounded by photographs that documented her transformation from uniformed military officer to civilian advocate to elder stateswoman of institutional reform movements. The book's conclusion emphasized themes that had defined her entire post-military career. Institutional accountability is not destination, but journey, she wrote in her final pages. Each generation must choose whether to maintain the progress achieved by previous generations or allow systematic dysfunction to return through neglect and complacency. The confrontation with Admiral Hartwell 30 years ago created opportunity for institutional transformation, but sustaining that transformation has required effort from thousands of individuals who chose courage over convenience. Her legacy lived on through the foundation that bore her name, the legislation that had transformed military justice, the cultural changes that had made military service safer and more equitable for all personnel, and most importantly, the example she had provided of individual courage in the face of institutional power. The cost had been everything she had worked for in her military career, but the benefit had extended far beyond her personal sacrifice to influence institutional culture for generations. The last photograph in her study showed the moment of confrontation. That had changed everything. Admiral Hartwell reaching toward her inappropriately, her defensive response, the shocked faces of witnesses who had never seen institutional power challenged so directly. But surrounding that image were dozens of others. Reform legislation being signed, female officers assuming senior leadership positions, graduation ceremonies for ethics programs, advocacy conferences bringing together survivors and supporters. Single moment of resistance had become catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond military circles to influence corporate culture, government accountability, academic institutions, and social movements throughout American society. Sarah Chen's courage had proved that individual action could overcome systematic oppression, that institutional change was possible when people chose justice over career security, that silence was never the answer when speaking out could protect others from harm. The foundation continued its work under new leadership, maintaining the mission while adapting to contemporary challenges that required constant vigilance against institutional dysfunction. The reforms that had emerged from the Admiral Hartwell case provided foundation for addressing new forms of workplace abuse, demonstrating that accountability measures could evolve while maintaining their essential purpose. As Sarah Chen's story concluded, her impact continued through every individual who chose resistance over submission, justice over convenience, truth over institutional loyalty. The admiral who had attempted to touch her had been stopped by broken bones and broken careers, but the more important victory had been the institutional transformation that ensured future generations would serve in environments where such behavior was neither tolerated nor protected. The silence had indeed been broken, and in its place had emerged voices of accountability, That would echo through military culture for generations to come. The crack echoed across the parade ground like a gunshot, silencing 150 voices mid-cheer. Admiral Marcus Hartwell's scream followed immediately after, a sound so raw and unexpected that several junior officers instinctively reached for sidearms that weren't there. The ceremony had been proceeding perfectly until that moment. Dress blues pressed to razor sharpness, metals catching the late afternoon sun, the smell of fresh paint still lingering from the base's preparation for this distinguished visit. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen stood motionless in the of it all, her right hand still gripping the Admiral's wrist or what remained of its structural integrity. Her face showed no emotion, no satisfaction, no fear. Just the steady, controlled breathing of someone who had made a decision and would live with its consequences. The Admiral's decorations, moments before gleaming with authority, now seemed to mock him as he cradled his injury against his chest, his face cycling through shock, rage, and something that might have been the first flicker of genuine fear he'd experienced in decades. The silence stretched like a taut wire. 150 pairs of eyes darted between the fallen admiral and the woman who had put him there. Some of those eyes belonged to men who had whispered about Sarah Chen in mess halls and barracks, whispered about her rapid promotions, her uncompromising standards, the way she could outthink most of her superiors and outwork all of them. Others belonged to women who had watched her navigate a system designed to break people like them, who had seen her succeed where they had been pushed aside or pushed out entirely. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Rodriguez was the first to move. She had served under Chen for 2 years, had watched her lead through everything from equipment failures to personnel crises with the kind of calm competence that made other officers jealous. Rodriguez stepped forward, not toward the Admiral, but positioning herself subtly between Chen and the crowd. It was a small gesture, but in the rigid hierarchy of military protocol, it spoke volumes. Senior Chief Marcus Thompson followed suit, his weathered face betraying nothing but his position unmistakable. The base itself seemed to hold its breath. Naval Air Station Meridian had been Sarah Chen's assignment for 3 years, long enough for her to know every hangar, every office, every corner where conversations happened that weren't supposed to happen. She knew which enlisted personnel struggled with family issues, which junior officers showed promise, which systems were operating beyond their recommended maintenance schedules. She knew the base's rhythms like a composer knows music, and right now, those rhythms had been shattered by the sound of breaking bone. Admiral Hartwell finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and higher than his usual commanding baritone. You're finished, Chen. Court-martial, prison, disgrace. He swayed slightly, whether from pain or shock, and Lieutenant Jake Morrison, Sarah's executive officer, instinctively moved to steady him before stopping himself. The gesture created its own moment of tension, another fracture in the normal order of things. Sarah Chen finally spoke, her voice carrying across the parade ground with the clarity that had made her legendary in briefing rooms. Admiral Hartwell attempted to sexually assault me in front of 150 witnesses. I defended myself using appropriate force. Each word was precise, measured, chosen for maximum impact. She wasn't speaking to the Admiral anymore, wasn't even speaking to the crowd. She was speaking to the record, to the investigation that would follow, to the system that would try to destroy her for this moment of resistance. The Admiral's face flushed deep red. That's a lie. I was simply... He stopped himself, perhaps realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. The gesture he had attempted moments before, the casual, possessive touch that powerful men had been using to claim and diminish women for centuries, could not be explained away. Not with 150 witnesses, not with security cameras, not in an age when such things were supposed to matter. Captain David Walsh, the base commander, finally stepped forward. Sarah had worked closely with Walsh for 3 years, respected him as much as she was capable of respecting any flag officer. His face was pale, the weight of the impossible situation settling over him like a shroud. He would have to navigate between protecting his officer and managing the career-ending implications of what had just occurred. The Admiral outranked him by 2 full grades, but Sarah Chen was his responsibility, his command. Medical team to the parade ground. Walsh's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management, though there was a tremor there that suggested this was unlike any crisis he had faced before. Security, establish a perimeter. Everyone else, return to your posts immediately. The crowd began to disperse with the reluctant efficiency of military personnel who wanted to stay and see how this unprecedented situation would unfold. As they moved, conversation started in whispers, quick, urgent exchanges that would spread through the base like wildfire. By evening chow, every person on Naval Air Station Meridian would know the story, and by morning, it would reach other bases, other commands, other corners of a military hierarchy that had never had to deal with anything quite like this. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's senior medical officer, approached with her team. She was a Navy commander with 15 years of experience treating everything from combat injuries to training accidents. But the look on her face suggested she had never been called to treat a flag officer injured by one of his subordinates. Her examination of the Admiral was professional, but perfunctory. The break was obvious. Compound, requiring immediate attention that the base medical facility was not equipped to provide. As the medical team prepared for evacuation, Admiral Hartwell's eyes found Sarah Chen one more time. The look that passed between them contained multitudes, his promise of retribution, her absolute refusal to show fear, and something else. Something that had been building in military culture for decades and had finally found its moment of reckoning. Master Chief Rodriguez leaned close to Sarah, her voice barely audible. "Ma'am, whatever happens next, you weren't wrong. It was a breach of protocol. An enlisted person offering support to an officer in a situation where support could be seen as choosing sides." But Rodriguez had been in the Navy for 22 years, had seen what silence and submission had cost too many good people, and she wasn't going to remain silent now. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at Sarah's other side, his young face serious. "Beyond his years. Orders, Commander?" It was a simple question, but loaded with meaning. He was asking whether she planned to run, to hide, to try to minimize what had happened. He was also asking whether he could count on her to lead them through whatever storm was coming. Sarah looked around the parade ground one more time, at the base that had been her home, at the people who had been her family, at the institution that had given her purpose, and was about to try to destroy her for refusing to be victimized by it. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and deceptive, like a memory already being formed. "We continue our mission," she said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just changed in her life. "We serve with honor, we protect those who need protection, and we never compromise our integrity for anyone's convenience." Admiral was loaded into the medical evacuation helicopter, still conscious, still glaring at her with promises of revenge. As the aircraft lifted off, the sound of its rotors gradually faded, leaving behind a base forever changed by a moment of resistance that had been decades in the making. Captain Walsh approached Sarah as the crowd finally dispersed. His expression was unreadable, caught between admiration and terror at the bureaucratic nightmare that was about to engulf his command. "Commander Chen," he said quietly, "my office, 1 hour. Bring Lieutenant Morrison as a witness." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was the beginning, not the end. The real battle would be fought in conference rooms and congressional hearings, in media interviews and military tribunals. But here, on this parade ground, in front of these witnesses, she had drawn a line that could never be uncrossed. As the sun set over Naval Air Station Meridian, casting long shadows across the tarmac where her moment of defiance had occurred, Sarah Chen walked back toward the headquarters building with the measured pace of someone who had chosen truth over safety, justice over career, and the protection of others over the protection of herself. The decision would cost her everything she had worked for, but it would also free her from the cage of silence that had trapped too many others. The base settled into evening routine, but nothing would ever be quite the same. In barracks and mess halls, in offices and hangars, the conversation had already begun quiet at first, but growing stronger with each telling. The story of the admiral who had finally gone too far, and the commander who had refused to let it happen. The aftermath of the incident rippled through the base like concentric circles in still water. As Sarah made her way back to the headquarters building, she passed groups of personnel who fell silent at her approach, not from hostility, but from a complex mixture of respect, concern, and uncertainty about how to react to someone who had just committed what might be either the most heroic or most career-ending act in recent military memory. Petty Officer, First Class Maria Santos, an aviation electronics technician who had served under Sarah's command for 18 months, caught her eye as she passed the maintenance hangar. Santos offered a barely perceptible nod, a gesture that could be dismissed as routine, military courtesy, but carried the weight of solidarity. Sarah had helped Santos through a difficult divorce, had written the recommendation that earned her a promotion, had trusted her with increasingly complex responsibilities. The nod said everything that military protocol prevented Santos from saying aloud. The base's communication systems were already buzzing with encrypted messages, flying between Naval Air Station Meridian and commands up and down the chain. Captain Walsh would be fielding calls from Admiral Hartwell's staff, from Naval Personnel Command, from congressional liaisons, who understood that incidents like this could become political dynamite if not handled with extreme care. The machinery of damage control was already in motion, though no one was quite sure yet what kind of damage they were trying to control. Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Park, the base's senior intelligence officer, intercepted Sarah near the headquarters entrance. Park was a careful man, methodical, the kind of intelligence professional who understood the value of information and the danger of speculation. His presence at this moment was significant. Intelligence officers rarely involved themselves in personnel matters unless those matters had broader implications. "Commander," Park said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had access to information others did not. "There are things you should know before your meeting with the captain." He glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard. Admiral Hartwell's visit wasn't routine. There have been inquiries, questions about his conduct at previous commands. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. If Park was sharing this information, it meant the situation was even more complex than she had realized. It also meant that her moment of resistance had occurred at the intersection of larger forces investigations, politics, institutional dysfunction that went far beyond one admiral's abuse of power. "How long have you known?" she asked. Park's expression was grim. "Rumors for months. Concrete intelligence for 3 weeks. We've been preparing contingencies." He paused, choosing his words carefully. What happened today may have prevented something worse from happening tomorrow. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Park's information was accurate, her confrontation with Admiral Hartwell hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that military intelligence had been tracking. It meant other women, other subordinates, other moments of predatory behavior that had been allowed to continue, because no one had been willing or able to stop it. As she entered the headquarters building, Sarah passed the wall of photographs that chronicled the base's history, decades of commanding officers, distinguished visitors, ceremonial events that had defined Naval Air Station Meridian's identity. Soon, there might be another photograph on that wall, documenting the visit that had ended in broken bones and broken careers. Or perhaps the photograph would be carefully excluded, relegated to classified files that would surface only if someone was determined enough to dig for the truth. The building itself seemed different now, charged with the tension of an institution, confronting its own contradictions. The Navy that had given Sarah Chen purpose and identity was the same Navy that had elevated Admiral Hartwell despite whatever warning signs had been ignored along the way. The system that rewarded merit and courage was the same system that protected powerful predators and punished those who challenged them. Lieutenant Morrison fell into step beside her as they approached Captain Walsh's office. Morrison was young, enough to still believe in the institution, old enough to understand that what they had witnessed would test that belief in ways he had never imagined. His loyalty to Sarah was absolute, but his career was just beginning, and associating himself with her situation could destroy his future before it had really started. "Sir," he said quietly, using the gender-neutral address that had become standard. "In the modern military, whatever you need from me, you have it." Sarah stopped walking and looked at him directly. "Jake, what I need from you is honesty in that room and careful consideration of your own future. Don't sacrifice your career for loyalty to me. The Navy needs officers like you, and this situation doesn't change that." Morrison's jaw tightened with determination. "With respect, Commander, the Navy also needs officers like you. What happened today, what you did, that's the kind of leadership I want to follow." They reached Captain Walsh's office, where the soft glow of fluorescent lighting spilled into the darkening corridor. Inside, Walsh would be preparing for one of the most difficult conversations of his career, knowing that every word would be scrutinized, every decision analyzed by people far above his pay grade. He would have to balance loyalty to a subordinate he respected with the political realities of challenging a flag officer, even one who had clearly stepped over the line. As Sarah raised her hand to knock on the door, she thought about all the women who had stood in similar corridors, facing similar choices throughout military history. Some had remained silent, accepting abuse as the price of service. Others had spoken out and been destroyed by the institutional machinery designed to protect those in power. A few had found ways to fight back, to create change, to ensure that their sacrifice meant something for those who came after. The sound of her knuckles against Captain Walsh's door marked the end of one phase of her life and the beginning of another. Everything she had worked for, everything she had achieved, would now be viewed through the lens of this single moment when she had refused to be victimized. The system would try to portray her as unstable, insubordinate, a danger to good order and discipline. But the witnesses had seen what really happened, and the truth, once released, had a way of surviving even the most sophisticated attempts at suppression. Sarah Chen's daily routine at Naval Air Station Meridian began at 0500 hours, 30 minutes, before official reveille in the quiet darkness that preceded the base's awakening. Her quarters were spartanly furnished but meticulously organized, a reflection of 18 years of military service that had taught her to find comfort in order, purpose, and discipline. The small desk by the window held 3 photographs: her parents at their naturalization ceremony in 1995, her Naval Academy graduating class, and her sister Jennifer with her 2 children at a beach in San Diego. These images anchored her to a world beyond the uniform, beyond the rank, beyond the careful construction of identity that military life demanded. The morning run was sacred time. 5 miles through the base's perimeter road that took her past hangars, administrative buildings, and the family housing area where the sounds of children getting ready for school mixed with the distant hum of aircraft engines. She ran alone, preferring the solitude to the camaraderie of group PT. It wasn't antisocial behavior. Sarah Chen was respected precisely because she engaged meaningfully with her subordinates and peers, but these early morning miles belonged to her, a space where she could think without the constant calculation that command required. Her route took her past the base child care center, where she often saw Lieutenant Paula Hendricks dropping off her 4-year-old daughter. Hendricks was a supply officer, competent, but struggling with the balance between military demands and single parenthood. Sarah had quietly arranged schedule modifications that allowed Hendricks to maintain her career while being present for her child, understanding that institutional flexibility often meant the difference between retaining good officers and losing them to impossible choices. The contradiction lived in Sarah's chest like a physical weight, her deep love for military service coupled with her clear-eyed recognition of its failures. She believed in the mission, in the honor of defending something larger than herself, in the bonds forged between people who had committed their lives to service. But she also saw how the institution protected mediocrity, how it elevated politics over performance, how it systemically failed the very people who served it most faithfully. Her office in the headquarters building reflected this complexity. Alongside the mandatory photographs of the President and Secretary of Defense hung a framed copy of her master's thesis on logistics management, completed during her tour at the Naval War College. The thesis had earned academic recognition and contributed to policy changes that improved supply chain efficiency across multiple commands. But it had also revealed her willingness to challenge established procedures, to question assumptions that others accepted without examination. The morning briefings were where Sarah's contradictions became most apparent. She demanded excellence from her staff but protected them from the petty bureaucratic harassment that too many commanders used to assert authority. When Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Kim made an error in fuel consumption calculations that could have resulted in a formal reprimand, Sarah assigned additional training rather than punishment, understanding that fear-based leadership created more problems than it solved. Her relationship with the enlisted personnel under her command was built on mutual respect that transcended rank. She remembered birthdays, family problems, professional aspirations. When Master Chief Rodriguez was struggling with her teenage son's behavioral issues, Sarah arranged for the family to receive counseling through base services, bypassing the bureaucratic obstacles that often prevented personnel from accessing help. When Senior Chief Thompson's wife was diagnosed with cancer, Sarah personally coordinated with the medical system to ensure the family received support while Thompson maintained his duties. But this connection to her people also made her acutely aware of their vulnerabilities. She knew which female personnel had received unwanted attention from senior officers, which junior enlisted members were struggling financially, which families were dealing with the stress of repeated deployments. She carried their struggles like stones in her pockets. Feeling responsible for problems she had limited power to solve within a system that often prioritized image over substance. The afternoon fitness sessions were another window into Sarah's character. While most officers maintained required physical standards with minimal effort, Sarah approached fitness with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Her workouts were methodical, purposeful, a reflection of her belief that excellence in small things translated to excellence in everything. She could outrun officers half her age, outperform most of her male peers in strength training, and maintain the physical standards that had earned her recognition throughout her career. Her evenings were spent in professional development, reading military journals, studying case histories, preparing for the staff college assignment that would position her for promotion to full commander and eventually captain. She understood that advancement in the modern Navy required not just competence but mastery of political nuance, institutional dynamics, the unspoken rules that governed career progression. The irony was not lost on her that succeeding in a system required understanding its dysfunctions well enough to navigate around them. The dreams came irregularly but persistently, fragments of memory from her early career when the challenges had been different. As a junior officer, she had faced the crude harassment that many women experienced, the inappropriate comments, the casual sexualization, the constant testing of boundaries that was supposed to be character building but felt more like systematic degradation. She had survived by being better than her peers, by outworking them, by proving her worth in ways that men never had to prove theirs. The memory that haunted her most was from her tour aboard the USS Hampton, a guided missile cruiser, where she had served as assistant supply officer. Lieutenant Commander Bradley Marsh, her department head, had made it clear that her fitness reports would depend on more than just professional performance. She had reported his behavior through proper channels and been quietly reassigned to shore duty, officially for career development, unofficially to prevent her from causing further problems. Marsh had been promoted on schedule and currently commanded a destroyer somewhere in the Pacific Fleet. That experience had taught her the system's fundamental equation. Women who remained silent could have careers. Women who spoke out could not. She had chosen silence, advancement, the careful construction of a professional reputation that would allow her to protect others even if she could not protect herself. But the compromise had cost her something essential, had created a hollow space in her chest where her faith in justice had once resided. Her sister, Jennifer, was the only person who truly understood the weight Sarah carried. During their monthly video calls, Jennifer would see past the uniform, past the rank, past the careful professional demeanor to the woman underneath. Jennifer had chosen civilian life, had married an accountant, had built the kind of normal existence that military service made nearly impossible. But she understood that Sarah's service was both gift and sacrifice, that her sister had given up the possibility of traditional happiness to pursue a mission that mattered more than personal fulfillment. The contradiction between Sarah's public success and private struggle was most apparent during social events. At the officers' club, she could engage in the ritual conversations about assignments and promotions, could navigate the complex social hierarchy that determined who spoke to whom about what. But she also saw how alcohol loosened tongues, how senior officers revealed their true attitudes about women in combat, about diversity initiatives, about the political correctness that they believed was undermining military readiness. She had learned to smile at these conversations while mentally cataloging information that might be useful later. She knew which commanders viewed female officers as diversity appointments rather than legitimate leaders, which staff officers made decisions based on personal prejudices rather than professional merit. This knowledge was both weapon and burden useful for protecting her people, corrosive to her faith in institutional integrity. Her quarters and the bachelor officers' quarters were located in Building 1247, a nondescript structure that housed single officers and geographic bachelors whose families lived elsewhere. The building had been her home for 3 years longer than any single assignment since her academy days. She had made it comfortable without making it permanent, understanding that military life required flexibility, adaptability, the willingness to leave behind anything that couldn't fit in regulation. Baggage allowances. The small kitchen rarely saw use beyond morning coffee and occasional evening meals. Sarah ate most of her meals at the officers' club or in her office, partly from convenience but mostly because solitary meals in her quarters emphasized the loneliness that military success often required. She had friends among her peer group, professional relationships built on mutual respect and shared experiences. But true intimacy was difficult when career considerations affected every relationship. When today's peer might be tomorrow's superior or subordinate. The bookshelf in her living room revealed the breadth of her intellectual interests: military history mixed with contemporary fiction, leadership studies alongside poetry, technical manuals next to philosophical works that helped her make sense of the contradictions she lived with daily. She read voraciously, partly for professional development, but mostly as an escape from the narrow world of military service into the broader realm of human experience. Late at night, when the base settled into quiet and she could finally drop the mask of command presence, Sarah sometimes stood at her window looking out at the flight line where aircraft sat in precise rows, ready for whatever mission might require their service. Those moments contained her purest understanding of why she had chosen this life, not for the institution with all its flaws, but for the mission itself, for the idea that some things were worth defending, even if the system doing the defending was imperfect. The phone calls from her parents came every Sunday evening, conversations conducted in a mixture of English and Mandarin that connected her to childhood memories of struggle and sacrifice. Her parents had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hope and determination, had worked multiple jobs to put her through high school, had watched with pride and bewilderment as their daughter chose a career they could never fully understand. They worried about her unmarried status, about the dangers of military service, about the loneliness they detected in her voice despite her professional success. Sarah's relationship with romantic love was complicated by the demands of military life and the reality of being a woman in a male-dominated profession. She had dated fellow officers but found that rank differences created impossible dynamics. Either she was subordinate to men who expected deference in personal relationships, or she was senior to men whose egos couldn't handle being outranked by their girlfriend. Civilian relationships were difficult because few outside the military understood the demands of service, the frequent separations, the way military identity permeated every aspect of life. The result was a kind of emotional compartmentalization that allowed her to function professionally while accepting personal loneliness as the price of her choices. She had made peace with this trade-off, understanding that extraordinary careers often required extraordinary sacrifices. But there were moments, usually late at night or early in the morning, when her guard was down, when she wondered what other version of her life might have looked like. Physical fitness remained one of her primary outlets for stress and frustration. The base gym at 0545 hours was her sanctuary, a place where the equality of sweat and effort temporarily erased the complications of rank and gender. She lifted weights with the focused intensity of someone who understood that physical strength translated to mental resilience, that maintaining peak condition was both personal discipline and professional requirement. Her workout partners were an eclectic group: Senior Chief Thompson, who had been powerlifting for 20 years, Lieutenant Morrison, who was trying to improve his run time for upcoming fitness assessments, Chief Petty Officer Lisa Wong, a cryptologic technician who found that morning workouts helped manage the stress of intelligence work. These relationships were built on shared effort rather than hierarchy, creating spaces where genuine connection was possible despite the formal structures that governed their professional interactions. The complexity of Sarah's position was perhaps most evident in her mentoring relationships with junior female officers. Lieutenant Hendricks, struggling with single parenthood. Ensign Rebecca Torres, brilliant but lacking confidence in her abilities. Lieutenant Junior Grade Amanda Foster, dealing with sexual harassment from a civilian contractor. Sarah provided guidance, support, protection when possible, but always within the constraints of a system that punished rocking the boat more than it punished the behavior that created problems in the first place. Her office walls displayed the awards and commendations that documented 18 years of exemplary service: Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, Navy Commendation Medal with 3 gold stars, Meritorious Service Medal, Joint Service Achievement Medal. Each award represented not just personal achievement, but also the cumulative trust of subordinates who had served under her command, peers who had worked alongside her, superiors who had recognized her contributions. But awards couldn't capture the full complexity of military leadership, the impossible choices, the moral compromises, the daily decisions that affected real people's lives in ways that would never appear in fitness reports or commendation citations. Sarah had learned to live with ambiguity, to accept that doing the right thing and following regulations were not always the same thing, to navigate the gap between institutional ideals and institutional realities. The first sign of systematic problems had appeared 18 months before Admiral Hartwell's fateful visit, though Sarah Chen didn't recognize the pattern until much later. Lieutenant Commander Jessica Martinez had requested an urgent meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. her normally composed demeanor cracked by exhaustion and something that looked like barely contained rage. Martinez was the base's legal officer, a sharp lawyer who had left a lucrative civilian practice to serve in the Navy's Judge Advocate General Corps, and she rarely showed emotion in professional settings. "We have a problem," Martinez had said without preamble, closing Sarah's office door and checking to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. 3 complaints in 6 months, all involving flag officers, all buried in paperwork and technicalities. She placed a thin folder on Sarah's desk, its contents representing hundreds of hours of investigation, documentation, and careful legal maneuvering. "The system is working exactly as designed to protect the system, not the people who serve." In it, the cases Martinez outlined were variations on a familiar theme. A rear admiral at Naval Air Station Pensacola who had created a hostile work environment for female staff officers, using his position to demand personal services that had nothing to do with military duties. A vice admiral at Naval Station Norfolk who had made career advancement contingent on social availability, requiring female officers to attend private dinners and weekend functions where alcohol flowed and boundaries blurred. A commodore at Naval Air Station Lemoore who had developed a reputation for hands-on leadership that involved literally putting his hands on subordinates in ways that violated every principle of professional conduct. Each complaint had been filed through proper channels, investigated by appropriate authorities, and resolved through administrative actions that protected careers, the careers of the perpetrators. The women who had come forward faced subtle retaliation, negative fitness reports, undesirable assignments, professional isolation that made continued service untenable. 2 had resigned their commissions, 1 had requested transfer to the inactive reserves, and all had been effectively silenced by the experience. "The system has an immune response," Martinez explained, her voice carrying the bitter wisdom of someone who had seen justice perverted by bureaucracy. "It identifies threats to institutional stability and neutralizes them. Right now, we're the threats anyone who challenges the established order, anyone who insists that standards should apply equally to everyone." Sarah had listened to Martinez's briefing with growing comprehension and horror. She had known that harassment existed throughout the military, had experienced it herself, and witnessed it affecting others. But the systematic nature of the problem, the institutional coordination required to suppress multiple complaints across different commands, suggested something far more troubling than isolated incidents of bad behavior. The second incident had occurred during the Navy's annual Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Training, a mandatory program designed to address exactly the kind of problems Martinez had documented. The training was conducted by Commander Robert Hayes, a former submarine officer who had transitioned to the Navy's personnel community after a career that included multiple command tours. Hayes was competent, professional, and completely tone-deaf to the irony of his message. The vast majority of sexual assault allegations are either false or exaggerated, Hayes had told an audience of 150 officers and senior enlisted personnel, his PowerPoint presentation showing statistics that had been carefully selected to support his thesis. "We need to be aware of the potential for malicious prosecution, for individuals who might use allegations as weapons against superiors they don't like or as excuses for poor performance." The presentation continued for 90 minutes, touching on legitimate issues of prevention and response, while consistently emphasizing the potential for false allegations rather than the reality of underreporting. Sarah had watched the faces around her as Hayes spoke, the knowing nods from senior officers, the uncomfortable shifting from junior personnel, the careful neutrality of those who understood that challenging the presenter could have career implications. During the question and answer period, Lieutenant Hendricks had raised her hand. "Sir, what about the studies showing that false allegations occur at roughly the same rate as other crimes, around 2 to 10%? Doesn't that suggest we should be more concerned about underreporting than overreporting?" Her voice was steady, professional, but Sarah could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful calculation of someone who knew she was walking into dangerous territory. Hayes had responded with condescending patience. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your concern, but those studies are often conducted by advocacy organizations with predetermined conclusions. In my experience, and I've been dealing with these issues for 15 years, false allegations are far more common than the politically correct statistics suggest." The exchange had crystallized everything. Sarah found troubling about institutional attitudes toward harassment and assault. The dismissal of evidence that contradicted preferred narratives, the appeal to authority over expertise, the subtle messaging that reporting incidents was inherently suspect. Hayes wasn't malicious, which made his presentation more dangerous than outright hostility. He represented the well-intentioned face of institutional dysfunction, the reasonable voice of unreasonable policies. The third incident had been more personal. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos had requested to speak with Sarah privately, a conversation that had taken place in the supply warehouse where Santos worked, surrounded by pallets of equipment and the familiar smell of industrial lubricants. Santos was one of Sarah's most trusted subordinates, a 30-year-old aviation electronics technician whose expertise had been crucial to maintaining the base's aging aircraft fleet. She was also struggling with a situation that exemplified the impossible choices military women faced daily. "Commander, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise you won't take any action without talking to me first," Santos had said, her voice tight with stress. "Captain Morrison, not our Lieutenant Morrison. The Captain Morrison from Wing Headquarters. He's been inappropriate text messages, comments about my appearance, suggestions about how my career could benefit from spending time with him off base." Sarah had felt the familiar cold anger that came with confronting institutional failure. Captain Brian Morrison was a decorated aviator with 23 years of service, a rising star in the naval aviation community who was being groomed for major command. He was also married with 3 children, a detail that somehow made his behavior more reprehensible rather than less. "He hasn't touched me or made explicit threats," Santos had continued, "but the message is clear. Play along and my career benefits. Refuse, and I face consequences. The problem is, I can't prove any of it. The text messages are gone. He deletes them after sending. The conversations happen when there are no witnesses. It's his word against mine, and we both know how that plays out." Sarah had wanted to promise immediate action, to assure Santos that the system would protect her and punish Morrison appropriately. But 18 years of military service had taught her that such promises were often lies, that institutional justice was frequently secondary to institutional stability. Instead, she had promised to help Santos navigate the situation safely, to document everything carefully, to build a case that might actually result in appropriate consequences. The investigation that followed had been a masterclass in bureaucratic obfuscation. Captain Morrison's text messages had indeed been deleted, but not before Santos had taken screenshots that she had wisely saved to a personal device. The private conversations were more difficult to document, but Santos had begun recording them using her smartphone, creating evidence that clearly demonstrated Morrison's pattern of inappropriate behavior. When Sarah had presented this evidence to Captain Walsh, his reaction had been everything she had feared. Concern for Santos was balanced against concern for Morrison's career, for the wing's operational requirements, for the political implications of removing a high-performing officer from a critical position. The evidence was compelling, but the consequences of acting on it would ripple through multiple commands, affecting readiness, morale, and the careers of officers who had committed no crime beyond failing to notice Morrison's behavior. "Can we handle this administratively?" Walsh had asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Career counseling, reassignment, perhaps early retirement." Morrison's got 23 years of service. He's eligible for retirement with full benefits. We could make this go away quietly, without destroying careers or generating media attention. The conversation had revealed the system's fundamental corruption, not malicious corruption, but the corruption of convenience, of avoiding difficult conversations, of prioritizing institutional comfort over individual justice. Morrison would face no meaningful consequences beyond early retirement with full benefits, while Santos would remain in an environment where speaking out had marked her as a troublemaker, regardless of the validity of her complaints. The fourth incident had involved Lieutenant Rebecca Torres, a brilliant young intelligence officer who had graduated at the top of her class from the Naval Academy and earned recognition for her analytical work during deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq. Torres was also struggling with confidence issues that Sarah recognized from her own early career, the constant second-guessing that came from working in environments where competence was questioned and every mistake was magnified beyond proportion. Torres had been assigned as the intelligence liaison for Admiral Hartwell's upcoming visit, a routine duty that should have involved coordinating briefings, preparing classified materials, and ensuring appropriate security measures were in place. Instead, it had become an exercise in professional humiliation orchestrated by Hartwell's staff with methodical precision. The problems had started with Admiral Hartwell's aide-de-camp, Commander Philip Garrison, a smooth-talking staff officer, whose primary qualification seemed to be his ability to anticipate his admiral's needs before they were expressed. Garrison had arrived at Naval Air Station Meridian 2 weeks before Hartwell's visit, ostensibly to conduct advance coordination, but actually to establish his authority over base personnel who would support the admiral's activities. Lieutenant Torres, Garrison had said during their first meeting, his tone carrying the casual condescension that staff officers often used with line officers they considered beneath their notice. I hope you understand that Admiral Hartwell expects the highest standards of support during his visit. He's been disappointed by the quality of briefings at other commands, and he won't tolerate anything less than perfection here. Torres had responded with professional courtesy, outlining the comprehensive briefing package she had prepared, the security arrangements that had been coordinated, the logistical details that would ensure the Admiral's visit proceeded smoothly. Her work was thorough, creative, and demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking that had earned her recognition throughout her career. Garrison had dismissed it with barely concealed impatience. "This isn't what the Admiral expects," he had said, pushing her materials back across the conference table. "He needs concise summaries, bullet points, visual aids that get straight to the point. What you've prepared here is too detailed, too academic. He doesn't have time to read through dense intelligence analysis." The criticism had stung because it was simultaneously unfair and impossible to address. Torres had prepared her materials according to standard intelligence briefing protocols, using formats that had been successful in previous high-level presentations. Garrison's feedback suggested that Admiral Hartwell preferred style over substance, simplified presentations over complex analysis. But when Torres had revised her materials accordingly, Garrison had criticized them for being too superficial, lacking the depth of analysis that a flag officer required. The pattern had continued for 2 weeks, with Garrison finding fault with every aspect of Torres's preparation. Her briefing slides were too cluttered, then too sparse. Her security arrangements were too restrictive, then too permissive. Her scheduling was too rigid, then too flexible. Each criticism required extensive revision, consuming hours that Torres could have spent on other duties, creating stress that began to affect her performance across all her responsibilities. Sarah had watched Torres struggle with growing concern, recognizing the systematic undermining that was designed to break down confidence rather than improve performance. She had seen similar tactics used against other female officers, particularly those whose competence threatened the mediocrity that some commanders preferred in their subordinates. The pattern was always the same: impossible standards, contradictory feedback, public criticism that created the impression of incompetence, regardless of actual performance quality. The situation had escalated during the final coordination meeting, held in Captain Walsh's conference room with representatives from every department that would support Admiral Hartwell's visit. Torres had presented her final briefing materials, incorporating all of Garrison's feedback, demonstrating her willingness to adapt to his preferences, despite the personal cost in time and stress. The presentation had been professional, comprehensive, and exactly what any reasonable person would expect from a competent intelligence officer. Garrison had waited until Torres finished before launching his attack. "This is exactly what I was concerned about," he had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone speaking for a flag officer. "The analysis is shallow, the presentation is amateurish, and the security recommendations show a fundamental misunderstanding of the Admiral's requirements. I'm afraid we'll need to bring in support from another command to ensure appropriate standards are maintained." The room had fallen silent, everyone understanding that Garrison was not just criticizing Torres's work, but questioning her professional competence in front of her peers and superiors. Torres had remained composed, but Sarah could see the impact in her posture, in the careful control that suggested she was fighting back tears, in the way her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her materials. Captain Walsh had attempted to mediate, suggesting that perhaps the disconnect was due to communication issues rather than performance problems. But Garrison had pressed his advantage, making it clear that Admiral Hartwell's staff had lost confidence in Torres's ability to support the visit appropriately. The implication was unmistakable: either Torres was replaced, or the visit would be considered a failure before it began. The fifth incident had occurred just days before Admiral Hartwell's arrival, involving Master Chief Rodriguez in a confrontation that crystallized everything wrong with the institutional culture Sarah had been observing. Rodriguez was preparing for the Admiral's inspection of enlisted quarters, a routine procedure that had been complicated by Garrison's ever-changing requirements and unrealistic standards. Rodriguez had 22 years of experience, including multiple deployments, command positions, and commendations for exceptional leadership. She understood military standards, knew what was required for successful inspections, and had prepared her personnel accordingly. But Garrison had different ideas about what Admiral Hartwell expected, ideas that seemed designed more to demonstrate his authority than to achieve any meaningful military objective. "The quarters need to be completely emptied and reset," Garrison had announced during a meeting with the base's senior enlisted leadership. "Personal items removed, furniture repositioned, floors stripped and rewaxed. The Admiral expects to see sterile conditions that demonstrate absolute attention to detail." Rodriguez had pointed out that such requirements exceeded standard inspection protocols, that emptying quarters would displace personnel who had nowhere else to store their belongings, that the time and resources required would interfere with operational duties. Her objections were practical, reasonable, based on years of experience managing similar situations. Garrison had dismissed them as resistance to authority. "Master Chief, I'm not interested in your opinions about what's reasonable or practical," he had said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose authority had been questioned. "I'm telling you what Admiral Hartwell expects, and your job is to make it happen. If you can't handle these requirements, perhaps we need to find someone who can." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Rodriguez's career, her reputation, her ability to serve her personnel effectively, all were contingent on her willingness to implement requirements that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating submission to arbitrary authority. She had complied, as military discipline required, but the cost had been visible in her interactions with the enlisted personnel who had to execute Garrison's demands. Sarah had watched her senior enlisted leadership struggle with the contradiction between serving their people and serving their superiors. Understanding that military discipline sometimes required choices that damaged both effectiveness and morale, Rodriguez had found ways to minimize the impact on her personnel, arranging temporary storage for displaced belongings, organizing work parties that shared the burden, maintaining unit cohesion despite the disruptive requirements. But the effort had taken its toll, creating stress and resentment that would outlast Admiral Hartwell's brief visit. The sixth incident had been the most revealing, occurring during Admiral Hartwell's arrival ceremony, when his behavior toward female personnel had been observed by multiple witnesses but dismissed as harmless by those in positions to address it. The Admiral had toured base facilities with his entourage, inspecting operations, meeting with key personnel, demonstrating the kind of engaged leadership that was supposed to inspire confidence and maintain standards. But Sarah had noticed patterns that others seemed to ignore or excuse. The way Hartwell's eyes lingered on female personnel, particularly younger women in junior enlisted ranks. The casual touches, hands on shoulders, arms around waists, gestures that lasted slightly too long and involved slightly too much contact to be purely professional. The comments about appearance that had nothing to do with military standards, but everything to do with personal attractiveness. During the tour of the communications center, Hartwell had spent considerable time with Petty Officer Second Class Jennifer Walsh, a 24-year-old radio operator whose technical expertise had earned recognition throughout the command. But Hartwell's attention seemed focused less on her professional competence than on her physical appearance, and his questions had gradually shifted from operational matters to personal ones. "Tell me about your family, Petty Officer Walsh," he had said, standing closer than military courtesy required. "Are you married? Children? I imagine young women like you face difficult choices between career and family." His hand had rested on her shoulder as he spoke, a gesture that could be interpreted as paternal concern, but felt more like possessive evaluation. Walsh had responded with professional courtesy, answering his questions while maintaining military bearing despite the obvious discomfort in her posture. She understood that refusing to engage would be seen as disrespectful, that challenging a flag officer's behavior would have career consequences regardless of the appropriateness of that behavior. The calculation was visible in her careful responses, her attempts to redirect conversation back to professional matters, her subtle efforts to create physical distance without appearing insubordinate. Sarah had intervened as diplomatically as possible, suggesting that the tour needed to continue to maintain the schedule, providing Walsh with an excuse to return to her duties. But the interaction had lasted long enough for other personnel to witness, to understand that Admiral Hartwell's interest in their female colleagues was not entirely professional, to recognize patterns of behavior that created uncomfortable dynamics. Throughout the command, the seventh incident had occurred during the evening reception at the Officers Club, a formal event designed to allow Admiral Hartwell to interact with the base's leadership in a more relaxed setting. The evening had proceeded according to protocol: cocktails, dinner, remarks from the Admiral about the base's performance and future challenges. But as alcohol flowed and formal restraints relaxed, Hartwell's behavior had become increasingly problematic. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had been assigned as his escort for the evening, a duty that required her to facilitate conversations, introduce him to key personnel, and ensure that his interactions reflected positively on both the Admiral and the base. She had performed these duties with the professional competence that had defined her career, but she had also been forced to manage increasingly uncomfortable situations as Hartwell's conduct deteriorated. The first sign of trouble had come during cocktails, when Hartwell had cornered Lieutenant Hendricks near the bar, engaging her in conversation that rapidly became personal rather than professional. Sarah had observed from across the room as Hendricks became visibly uncomfortable, as her responses became shorter and more formal, as she looked around for escape routes that didn't exist without appearing rude to a flag officer. "Your daughter must be very proud of her mother's service," Hartwell had said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. Single mothers face such challenges in the military. It's important to have support systems, mentorship opportunities. Perhaps we could discuss your career development over dinner sometime. Private conversation, away from the formality of official channels. The invitation was inappropriate on multiple levels, personal rather than professional, suggesting private meetings that had nothing to do with military duties, implying that Hendrix's career advancement might depend on social availability. Sarah had intervened again, suggesting that Admiral Hartwell meet other officers who had been waiting to speak with him, providing Hendrix with an opportunity to escape the conversation gracefully. The pattern had continued throughout the evening, with Hartwell focusing disproportionate attention on female officers, particularly those he perceived as vulnerable or in need of career assistance. His conversations consistently crossed professional boundaries, moving from military matters to personal ones, from official concerns to private invitations, from appropriate interest to predatory evaluation. The breaking point had come near the end of the evening, when Admiral Hartwell had cornered Ensign Rebecca Torres in the club's small library, a space that was technically public but practically private given the location and late hour. Sarah had discovered them there during a routine check to ensure all guests were accounted for, finding Torres trapped in conversation with an admiral whose behavior had clearly crossed from inappropriate to threatening. Ensign Torres has such potential, Hartwell had said when Sarah appeared, his arm around Torres's waist in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive. Brilliant mind, exceptional analytical skills, exactly the kind of officer the Navy needs in intelligence positions. With the right mentorship, the right opportunities, she could have an outstanding career. I've been explaining to her how important it is to maintain close relationships with senior officers who can provide guidance and support. Torres's face had been pale, her posture rigid with the kind of controlled fear that Sarah recognized from her own early experiences with predatory superiors. The posture rigid with the kind of controlled fear that Sarah recognized from her own early experiences with predatory superiors. Ensign was trapped between military discipline that required respectful interaction with flag officers and personal safety that demanded resistance to unwanted advances. The calculation was impossible: comply and face escalating demands, resist and face career destruction. Sarah had ended the conversation as professionally as possible, citing protocol requirements and schedule constraints that required Admiral Hartwell's attention elsewhere. But the damage had been done, the pattern established, the message communicated clearly to anyone with eyes to see. Admiral Hartwell viewed female officers as potential victims rather than professional colleagues, and the institutional structure that was supposed to protect them was failing completely. The eighth and final incident had been the culmination of everything Sarah had observed over the previous months. The moment when patterns became personal and professional obligations collided with moral imperatives. It had occurred during the formal ceremony that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of Admiral Hartwell's visit, when his predatory behavior had finally targeted her directly in front of the assembled command. The ceremony had been perfect by military standards: uniforms pressed, formations precise, speeches appropriate for the occasion. Admiral Hartwell had praised the base's performance, recognized outstanding personnel, delivered remarks about Navy values and professional excellence. But as the formal portion concluded and personnel began to disperse, he had approached Sarah for what appeared to be routine thanks for her role in coordinating his visit. "Commander Chen," he had said, his voice warm with apparent appreciation, "your support during this visit has been exceptional. Professional competence of the highest order. The Navy needs more officers like you in positions of responsibility." His words had been appropriate, the kind of recognition that any officer would welcome from a flag officer. But his actions had told a different story. The hand on her shoulder had been the first boundary crossed, lingering too long and applying pressure that suggested ownership rather than professional appreciation. The movement closer had been the second, eliminating the space that military courtesy required between officers of different ranks. The whispered comment had been the third and most damning, words that revealed intentions that had nothing to do with military professionalism. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in private," he had murmured, his breath close enough to her ear to be unmistakably intimate. "I'm staying at the VIP quarters tonight, departing tomorrow afternoon. There are career opportunities we could discuss. Ways that exceptional officers like you can advance more rapidly with appropriate support and guidance." The invitation had been clear, the quid pro quo unmistakable, the abuse of authority absolute. Admiral Hartwell was offering career advancement in exchange for sexual availability, using his position to coerce compliance from a subordinate who had no recourse through official channels. It was the same pattern Sarah had witnessed targeting other women, now directed at her personally with the assumption that rank and power made resistance impossible. But Sarah Chen had spent 18 years preparing for this moment, building the skills and reputation that would allow her to resist institutional corruption when it finally targeted her directly. The months of observing Hartwell's pattern, of documenting his behavior, of supporting other women who had been victimized by the system's failures, had crystallized into perfect clarity about what needed to happen next. The crack of Admiral Hartwell's wrist breaking had been the sound of institutional immunity shattering, of decades of protected predatory behavior finally meeting consequences that couldn't be covered up or explained away. It had also been the sound of Sarah's career ending, of her sacrifice for principles that the system claimed to value but rarely protected when they conflicted with powerful interests. As Admiral Hartwell's screams echoed across the parade ground, and 150 witnesses processed what they had just seen, Sarah Chen understood that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The system would try to destroy her for refusing to be victimized, for defending herself when official channels had failed, for prioritizing justice over institutional stability. But she had also demonstrated something that every witness would remember for the rest of their careers, that resistance was possible, that predatory behavior could be stopped, that women in uniform didn't have to accept abuse as the price of service. The cost would be everything she had worked for, but the benefit would extend far beyond her personal sacrifice to every woman who would serve after her. Investigation that followed Admiral Hartwell's injury moved with the swift efficiency of an institution protecting itself from scandal. Within 6 hours of the incident, investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service had arrived at Naval Air Station Meridian, their presence marking the transition from local command issue to potential federal crime. The speed of their response suggested preparation, as if mechanisms had been in place for exactly this type of situation, though whether to protect the victim or the accused remained unclear. Special Agent Patricia Reeves was the lead investigator, a 20-year veteran of NCIS with experience in high-profile cases involving senior military officials. Her reputation preceded her thorough, uncompromising, immune to the political pressures that often influenced military investigations. She had built her career on cases that other agents avoided, understanding that integrity sometimes required accepting career limitations in exchange for professional principles. The initial interviews revealed the careful choreography of institutional damage control. Admiral Hartwell, despite his injury, had managed to provide a statement from his hospital bed that portrayed the incident as an unprovoked assault by an unstable officer who had misinterpreted routine professional interaction as something more sinister. His version of events carefully omitted the pattern of behavior that had preceded the confrontation, focusing instead on Sarah's violent overreaction to what he characterized as normal command engagement. Commander Chen seemed agitated throughout. "My visit," Hartwell had told investigators, his voice weak from pain medication but clear in its accusations, I had noticed concerning behavioral patterns: isolation from peers, defensive responses to routine questions, what appeared to be paranoid ideation about supposed threats to her career. When I attempted to offer career guidance, she responded with immediate violence. It was completely unprovoked and entirely disproportionate. The statement was masterfully constructed, incorporating enough truth to be credible while reframing the context entirely. Hartwell's offer of career guidance became legitimate mentorship rather than sexual coercion. Sarah's defensive posture became paranoid behavior rather than justified wariness. The physical confrontation became unprovoked assault rather than self-defense against unwanted sexual contact. But Hartwell's statement contained a fatal flaw that Agent Reeves recognized immediately. It ignored the presence of 150 witnesses who had observed the entire interaction. Military ceremonies were recorded by multiple cameras, conversations were overheard by personnel standing nearby, and the sequence of events had been witnessed by individuals whose credibility could not be easily dismissed. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Morrison, Sarah's executive officer, had been recording the ceremony on his personal smartphone, intending to create a commemorative video for the base's social media presence. The recording captured not just the moment of physical confrontation, but the preceding conversation, Admiral Hartwell's inappropriate touching, and Sarah's clear attempts to maintain professional distance before defending herself. "The audio is crystal clear," Agent Reeves explained to Captain Walsh during a private briefing. Admiral Hartwell's exact words were, "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in private. I'm staying at the VIP quarters tonight. There are career opportunities we could discuss. Ways that exceptional officers like you can advance more rapidly with appropriate support." That's textbook quid pro quo sexual harassment, and it's followed immediately by unwanted physical contact. Captain Walsh's face had gone pale as he processed the implications. The recording didn't just contradict Admiral Hartwell's version of events. It provided irrefutable evidence of sexual harassment by a flag officer, captured on video with audio clarity that would survive any legal challenge. The political ramifications extended far beyond Naval Air Station Meridian to the highest levels of Navy leadership, to congressional oversight committees, to media outlets that would seize on the story with devastating effectiveness. The second revelation came from Chief Warrant Officer Park's intelligence files, which contained months of carefully documented reports about Admiral Hartwell's conduct at previous commands. Park had been building a case slowly and methodically, understanding that accusations against flag officers required overwhelming evidence to overcome institutional resistance. His files contained sworn statements, documented incidents, pattern analysis that revealed systematic predatory behavior spanning multiple assignments. "We have testimony from 14 women across 4 different commands," Park explained to the investigative team. "The pattern is consistent: inappropriate comments, unwanted physical contact, career advancement contingent on social availability, retaliation against those who refuse to comply." Admiral Hartwell has been protected by a network of staff officers who facilitated his behavior and senior leaders who prioritize his operational performance over his personal conduct. The documentation was devastating in its thoroughness. Park had identified Command Master Chief Robert Hayes at Naval Air Station Pensacola, who had actively discouraged female personnel from reporting Hartwell's behavior, suggesting that such complaints would be seen as disloyalty to the chain of command. Lieutenant Commander David Brooks at Naval Station Norfolk had arranged private meetings between Hartwell and junior female officers, meetings that had no operational purpose but clear personal implications. Most damning was the discovery of a confidential fitness report written by Hartwell for Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos during her previous assignment. The report contained language that was superficially professional, but clearly referenced her refusal to engage in inappropriate behavior. Lieutenant Commander Santos demonstrates technical competence but lacks the interpersonal skills necessary for advancement to senior leadership positions. Her inability to build productive relationships with senior officers may limit her potential for major command. Agent Reeves understood that the fitness report was both evidence of retaliation and proof of pattern. Hartwell had used his authority to damage Santos's career specifically because she had rejected his advances, creating a permanent record that would follow her through subsequent assignments. The language was carefully crafted to appear legitimate while conveying the message that refusing Hartwell's attention had professional consequences. The third revelation emerged from the base's security surveillance system, which had captured far more than anyone had initially realized. The cameras covered not just the parade ground where the physical confrontation occurred, but the VIP quarters where Admiral Hartwell had been staying, the officers' club where the previous evening's reception had taken place, and multiple locations throughout the base where inappropriate interactions had been observed. Technical Sergeant Lisa Park, the base's senior information systems specialist, had been quietly copying surveillance footage to secure servers, understanding that such evidence often disappeared when investigations involved high-ranking officials. Her technical expertise had ensured that the recordings were preserved in multiple formats, time-stamped and encrypted in ways that would maintain their evidentiary value regardless of institutional pressure to suppress them. The footage from the Officers' Club is particularly revealing, Agent Reeves noted during her briefing to Navy leadership. We have multiple instances of Admiral Hartwell engaging in behavior that clearly violates professional boundaries. Prolonged physical contact with female officers, conversations that move from professional to personal topics, invitations to private meetings that have no operational justification. The surveillance footage corroborated witness statements and provided visual evidence of pattern behavior that extended throughout Hartwell's visit. The recording showed his targeting of vulnerable personnel, junior officers, single mothers, women who were geographically isolated from family support systems. They documented his escalating aggression when professional deflection tactics were employed, his increasing boldness as he encountered minimal resistance from institutional authority. The fourth revelation came from an investigation of Admiral Hartwell's personal communications, which revealed extensive coordination with a network of officers who had facilitated his predatory behavior across multiple commands. Text messages, emails, and official correspondence showed systematic efforts to identify vulnerable female personnel, to arrange opportunities for inappropriate contact, and to suppress complaints when they occurred. Commander Philip Garrison, Hartwell's aide-de-camp, had been particularly active in this network, using his position to gather intelligence about female officers' personal situations, career vulnerabilities, and potential susceptibility to coercive approaches. His communications revealed detailed discussions about which women were likely to comply with advances, which had family situations that could be exploited, which were sufficiently isolated to be targeted without significant risk. Garrison's text messages read like hunting strategies, Agent Reeves observed with barely concealed disgust. He's identifying targets, assessing vulnerabilities, coordinating approaches. Lieutenant Torres is described as insecure and ambitious perfect combination. Master Chief Rodriguez is noted as too experienced and connected avoid direct approach. It's systematic predation with military precision. The communications network extended beyond Hartwell's immediate staff to include officers at multiple commands, who had provided similar services in exchange for career advancement. The investigation revealed a sophisticated system for identifying, approaching, and silencing victims that had operated for years without effective challenge from official oversight. Mechanisms. The fifth revelation emerged from psychiatric evaluations conducted by Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's senior medical officer, who had been treating female personnel for stress-related disorders at unusually high rates during the months preceding Admiral Hartwell's visit. Her medical records, properly subpoenaed and reviewed, revealed patterns of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress that correlated directly with exposure to senior military leadership. I've been seeing symptoms consistent with workplace harassment for months, Dr. Foster explained to investigators. Sleep disorders, anxiety attacks, depression, social withdrawal, all in otherwise healthy young women who were performing well professionally. When I asked about potential stressors, the conversations always came back to interactions with senior officers, but the patients were too frightened to be specific about what was happening. Dr. Foster's testimony provided crucial context for understanding the broader impact of Hartwell's behavior on base personnel. The medical evidence demonstrated that his actions had created a climate of fear and stress that affected not just direct victims but anyone who observed or heard about inappropriate conduct. The psychological impact extended throughout the command, degrading performance and morale in ways that would outlast his brief visit. The sixth revelation came from congressional staff members who had been monitoring military sexual assault prevention programs and had flagged Admiral Hartwell's commands for unusually high rates of personnel turnover among female officers. Congressional investigators had been quietly gathering information about systemic failures in military justice systems, and Hartwell's case provided a perfect example of institutional dysfunction. Senator Patricia Morrison, chair of the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Personnel, had been receiving complaints about military sexual harassment for months, but had been frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence that could support legislative action. The documentation from Naval Air Station Meridian provided exactly the kind of evidence needed to demonstrate that current policies were failing to protect service members from predatory leadership. This case represents everything wrong with military justice, Senator Morrison declared during an emergency briefing with Navy leadership. We have a flag officer who operated with impunity for years, systematically victimizing subordinates while being protected by an institutional culture that prioritized his career over their safety. The fact that it took physical violence to stop his behavior demonstrates complete failure of preventive systems. The congressional investigation revealed that complaints about Admiral Hartwell had reached Navy personnel command on multiple occasions, but had been dismissed as personality conflicts, professional disagreements, or attempts by underperforming officers to deflect responsibility for their failures. The pattern of dismissal was so consistent that it suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate suppression of inconvenient information. The seventh revelation emerged from media investigations that had been triggered by leaks from personnel within the military justice system who were frustrated by years of watching predatory behavior go unpunished. Journalists with experience covering military affairs had been developing sources throughout the Pentagon, waiting for a case that would illustrate broader systemic problems with sufficient evidence to survive legal challenges. Sarah's response was measured, carrying the same quiet strength that had defined her throughout the ordeal. Master Chief, what we did, all of us who spoke up, we did what military service actually demands. Not blind obedience to authority, but loyalty to the principles that authority is supposed to serve. As the ceremony concluded and personnel dispersed, Sarah found herself walking the familiar paths of the base she had once called home. The hangar where her confrontation with Admiral Hartwell had occurred now housed a training program on professional conduct and institutional accountability, a fitting transformation that turned the site of her resistance into a foundation for lasting change. Lieutenant Morrison, now Lieutenant Commander Morrison, caught up with her near the flight line. His career had flourished since the trial, but more importantly, he had become a voice for junior officers who witnessed misconduct, but struggled with the complex dynamics of military hierarchy. "Commander," he said, still using her former rank, "out of respect, I wanted you to know that the policy changes you catalyzed have spread throughout the fleet. Commands are implementing the Meridian Standard, that's what they're calling it. Zero tolerance for predatory behavior, protection for those who report it, and accountability that extends all the way to flag officers. Sarah smiled at the irony. Naval Air Station Meridian, once a symbol of institutional dysfunction, had become the benchmark for reform throughout the Navy. The base where she had ended her career had become the foundation for protecting countless others who would follow. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Morrison, Sarah's executive officer, had been recording the ceremony on his personal smartphone, intending to create a commemorative video for the base's social media presence. The recording captured not just the moment of physical confrontation, but the preceding conversation, Admiral Hartwell's inappropriate touching, and Sarah's clear attempts to maintain professional distance before defending herself. The audio is crystal clear, Agent Reeves explained to Captain Walsh during a private briefing. Admiral Hartwell's exact words were, "Perhaps we could continue this conversation in private. I'm staying at the VIP quarters tonight. There are career opportunities we could discuss. Ways that exceptional officers like you can advance more rapidly with appropriate support. That's textbook quid pro quo sexual harassment, and it's followed immediately by unwanted physical contact." Captain Walsh's face had gone pale as he processed the implications. The recording didn't just contradict Admiral Hartwell's version of events. It provided irrefutable evidence of sexual harassment by a flag officer, captured on video with audio clarity that would survive any legal challenge. The political ramifications extended far beyond Naval Air Station Meridian to the highest levels of Navy leadership, to congressional oversight committees, to media outlets that would seize on the story with devastating effectiveness. The second revelation came from Chief Warrant Officer Park's intelligence files, which contained months of carefully documented reports about Admiral Hartwell's conduct at previous commands. Park had been building the case slowly and methodically, understanding that accusations against flag officers required overwhelming evidence to overcome institutional resistance. His files contained sworn statements, documented incidents, pattern analysis that revealed systematic predatory behavior spanning multiple assignments. "We have testimony from 14 women across 4 different commands," Park explained to the investigative team. "The pattern is consistent inappropriate comments, unwanted physical contact, career advancement contingent on social availability, retaliation against those who refuse to comply." Admiral Hartwell has been protected by a network of staff officers who facilitated his behavior and senior leaders who prioritized his operational performance over his personal conduct. The documentation was devastating in its thoroughness. Park had identified Command Master Chief Robert Hayes at Naval Air Station Pensacola, who had actively discouraged female personnel from reporting Hartwell's behavior, suggesting that such complaints would be seen as disloyalty to the chain of command. Lieutenant Commander David Brooks at Naval Station Norfolk had arranged private meetings between Hartwell and junior female officers, meetings that had no operational purpose but clear personal implications. Most damning was the discovery of a confidential fitness report written by Hartwell for Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos during her previous assignment. The report contained language that was superficially professional, but clearly referenced her refusal to engage in inappropriate behavior. Lieutenant Commander Santos demonstrates technical competence, but lacks the interpersonal skills necessary for advancement to senior leadership positions. Her inability to build productive relationships with senior officers may limit her potential for major command. Agent Reeves understood that the fitness report was both evidence of retaliation and proof of pattern. Hartwell had used his authority to damage Santos's career specifically because she had rejected his advances, creating a permanent record that would follow her through subsequent assignments. The language was carefully crafted to appear legitimate, while conveying the message that refusing Hartwell's attention had professional consequences. The third revelation emerged from the base's security surveillance system, which had captured far more than anyone had initially realized. The cameras covered not just the parade ground where the physical confrontation occurred, but the VIP quarters where Admiral Hartwell had been staying, the officers' club where the previous evening's reception had taken place, and multiple locations throughout the base where inappropriate interactions had been observed. Technical Sergeant Lisa Park, the base's senior information systems specialist, had been quietly copying surveillance footage to secure servers, understanding that such evidence often disappeared when investigations involved high-ranking officials. Her technical expertise had ensured that the recordings were preserved in multiple formats, time-stamped and encrypted in ways that would maintain their evidentiary value regardless of institutional pressure to suppress them. The footage from the Officers' Club is particularly revealing, Agent Reeves noted during her briefing to Navy leadership. We have multiple instances of Admiral Hartwell engaging in behavior that clearly violates professional boundaries, prolonged physical contact with female officers, conversations that move from professional to personal topics, invitations to private meetings that have no operational justification. The surveillance footage corroborated witness statements and provided visual evidence of pattern behavior that extended throughout Hartwell's visit. The recording showed his targeting of vulnerable personnel, junior officers, single mothers, women who were geographically isolated from family support systems. They documented his escalating aggression when professional deflection tactics were employed, his increasing boldness as he encountered minimal resistance from institutional authority. The fourth revelation came from an investigation of Admiral Hartwell's personal communications, which revealed extensive coordination with a network of officers who had facilitated his predatory behavior across multiple commands. Text messages, emails, and official correspondence showed systematic efforts to identify vulnerable female personnel, to arrange opportunities for inappropriate contact, and to suppress complaints when they occurred. Commander Philip Garrison, Hartwell's aide-de-camp, had been particularly active in this network, using his position to gather intelligence about female officers' personal situations, career vulnerabilities, and potential susceptibility to coercive approaches. His communications revealed detailed discussions about which women were likely to comply with advances, which had family situations that could be exploited, which were sufficiently isolated to be targeted without significant risk. Garrison's text messages read like hunting strategies, Agent Reeves observed with barely concealed disgust. He's identifying targets, assessing vulnerabilities, coordinating approaches. Lieutenant Torres is described as insecure and ambitious, perfect combination. Master Chief Rodriguez is noted as too experienced and connected, avoid direct approach. It's systematic predation with military precision. The communications network extended beyond Hartwell's immediate staff to include officers at multiple commands, who had provided similar services in exchange for career advancement. The investigation revealed a sophisticated system for identifying, approaching, and silencing victims that had operated for years without effective challenge from official oversight. Mechanisms. The fifth revelation emerged from psychiatric evaluations conducted by Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's senior medical officer, who had been treating female personnel for stress-related disorders at unusually high rates during the months preceding Admiral Hartwell's visit. Her medical records, properly subpoenaed and reviewed, revealed patterns of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress that correlated directly with exposure to senior military leadership. I've been seeing symptoms consistent with workplace harassment for months, Dr. Foster explained to investigators. Sleep disorders, anxiety attacks, depression, social withdrawal, all in otherwise healthy young women who were performing well professionally. When I asked about potential stressors, the conversations always came back to interactions with senior officers, but the patients were too frightened to be specific about what was happening. Dr. Foster's testimony provided crucial context for understanding the broader impact of Hartwell's behavior on base personnel. The medical evidence demonstrated that his actions had created a climate of fear and stress that affected not just direct victims but anyone who observed or heard about inappropriate conduct. The psychological impact extended throughout the command, degrading performance and morale in ways that would outlast his brief visit. The sixth revelation came from congressional staff members who had been monitoring military sexual assault prevention programs and had flagged Admiral Hartwell's commands for unusually high rates of personnel turnover among female officers. Congressional investigators had been quietly gathering information about systemic failures in military justice systems, and Hartwell's case provided a perfect example of institutional dysfunction. Senator Patricia Morrison, chair of the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Personnel, had been receiving complaints about military sexual harassment for months, but had been frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence that could support legislative action. The documentation from Naval Air Station Meridian provided exactly the kind of evidence needed to demonstrate that current policies were failing to protect service members from predatory leadership. This case represents everything wrong with military justice, Senator Morrison declared during an emergency briefing with Navy leadership. We have a flag officer who operated with impunity for years, systematically victimizing subordinates while being protected by an institutional culture that prioritized his career over their safety. The fact that it took physical violence to stop his behavior demonstrates complete failure of preventive systems. The congressional investigation revealed that complaints about Admiral Hartwell had reached Navy personnel command on multiple occasions, but had been dismissed as personality conflicts, professional disagreements, or attempts by underperforming officers to deflect responsibility for their failures. The pattern of dismissal was so consistent that it suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate suppression of inconvenient information. The seventh revelation emerged from media investigations that had been triggered by leaks from personnel within the military justice system who were frustrated by years of watching predatory behavior go unpunished. Journalists with experience covering military affairs had been developing sources throughout the Pentagon, waiting for a case that would illustrate broader systemic problems with sufficient evidence to survive legal challenges. Sarah's response was measured, carrying the same quiet strength that had defined her throughout the ordeal. Master Chief, what we did, all of us who spoke up, we did what military service actually demands. Not blind obedience to authority, but loyalty to the principles that authority is supposed to serve. As the ceremony concluded and personnel dispersed, Sarah found herself walking the familiar paths of the base she had once called home. The hangar where her confrontation with Admiral Hartwell had occurred now housed a training program on professional conduct and institutional accountability, a fitting transformation that turned the site of her resistance into a foundation for lasting change. Lieutenant Morrison, now Lieutenant Commander Morrison, caught up with her near the flight line. His career had flourished since the trial, but more importantly, he had become a voice for junior officers who witnessed misconduct, but struggled with the complex dynamics of military hierarchy. "Commander," he said, still using her former rank, "out of respect, I wanted you to know that the policy changes you catalyzed have spread throughout the fleet. Commands are implementing the Meridian Standard, that's what they're calling it. Zero tolerance for predatory behavior, protection for those who report it, and accountability that extends all the way to flag officers." Sarah smiled at the irony. Naval Air Station Meridian, once a symbol of institutional dysfunction, had become the benchmark for reform throughout the Navy. The base where she had ended her career had become the foundation for protecting countless others who would follow. Transformation wasn't limited to policy documents and training programs. Captain Walsh, now Rear Admiral Walsh, had been selected for promotion partly because of his commitment to implementing meaningful reform rather than cosmetic changes. His leadership at Meridian had become a model for other commanders facing similar challenges. demonstrating that institutional change was possible when senior leaders prioritized substance over appearance. "The culture shift is real," Walsh had told Sarah during their private conversation before the ceremony. "Officers who enable harassment face career consequences. Women who report misconduct receive support rather than retaliation. The changes aren't perfect, but they're fundamental. Your sacrifice bought us the opportunity to do better." The ripple effects had spread far beyond military circles. Corporate diversity programs cited the Admiral Hartwell case as evidence that institutional change required more than policy statements. It demanded accountability mechanisms that could reach the highest levels of organizational hierarchy. Universities used the case study in leadership courses, examining how individual courage could catalyze systematic reform when supported by appropriate institutional responses. Sarah's transition to civilian life had been challenging but ultimately rewarding. She had accepted a position with a veterans advocacy organization, using her experience to help other service members navigate the complex terrain of military justice and institutional accountability. Her work focused particularly on supporting women who faced harassment or assault within military hierarchies, providing both practical assistance and the credibility that came from personal experience. The organization had grown significantly since her arrival, supported by donors who recognized the importance of institutional reform and the courage required to challenge systematic dysfunction. Sarah's story had become a recruiting tool for the organization, demonstrating to potential staff and volunteers that meaningful change was possible even against overwhelming institutional resistance. Her first major project involved developing training programs for military commanders on recognizing and addressing harassment before it escalated to assault. The programs drew on her 18 years of military experience, the institutional knowledge gained through her ordeal, and the perspective that came from sacrificing everything for principle. The training was soon adopted throughout multiple military branches, another indication that her resistance had catalyzed changes extending far beyond her original command. The personal cost remained significant. Sarah's marriage had not survived the stress and publicity of the trial, though she and her ex-husband maintained an amicable relationship focused on co-parenting their teenage daughter. The end of her military career had required rebuilding her identity around civilian pursuits, discovering aspects of herself that had been subsumed by military service since she was 22 years old. But the meaning derived from institutional impact provided compensation that transcended personal loss. Letters arrived regularly from women throughout the military, sharing stories of harassment that had been addressed rather than covered up, careers that had been protected rather than destroyed, and a culture that was slowly but definitively changing in response to the precedent her resistance had established. One letter particularly moved her, from a young naval officer who had just graduated from the academy. "Commander Chen," it read, "I learned about your case during leadership training at Annapolis. The instructors used it to teach us that military honor sometimes requires challenging the very system we serve, that loyalty to principles matters more than loyalty to personalities. Because of what you did, I'm entering fleet service knowing that my voice will be heard if I need to report misconduct, that my career won't be destroyed for standing up to predatory behavior." The letter captured the broader significance of Sarah's moment of resistance. She had not just protected herself from assault or exposed one predatory admiral. She had fundamentally altered the calculus that young officers used when deciding whether to report misconduct or challenge institutional dysfunction. The culture of silence and retaliation that had protected Admiral Hartwell for years was being replaced by expectations of accountability that extended throughout military hierarchies. Admiral Hartwell himself had faded into the obscurity that typically accompanied military disgrace. His appeal of the court-martial verdict had been unsuccessful. His attempts to rehabilitate his reputation through media interviews had been widely dismissed. and his 10-year prison sentence was being served in federal facilities designed for disgraced officials. The man who had once wielded enormous institutional power had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of abusing authority. More significantly, the systematic investigation of his network had led to additional prosecutions and administrative actions throughout the Navy. Officers who had facilitated his behavior, suppressed complaints, or participated in retaliation against victims faced consequences ranging from career limitations to criminal charges. The message was clear. Enabling predatory behavior would carry professional and legal consequences comparable to engaging in it directly. The broader institutional response had exceeded even optimistic expectations for reform. The Navy had implemented comprehensive changes to reporting mechanisms, investigation procedures, and accountability measures that addressed not just individual incidents, but the cultural dynamics that had made systematic harassment inevitable. Other military branches had adopted similar reforms, recognizing that the problems exposed at Naval Air Station Meridian were not unique to the Navy. Congressional oversight had been fundamentally transformed, with lawmakers recognizing that previous approaches to military sexual assault prevention had been inadequate to address institutional dysfunction. The Sarah Chen Act, passed 18 months after the trial, provided enhanced protection for victims, independent investigation mechanisms, and accountability measures that could reach flag officers despite traditional institutional protections. Senator Patricia Morrison, the legislation's primary sponsor, had used Sarah's story to build bipartisan support for comprehensive reform. Commander Chen's courage, Morrison had argued during floor debate, demonstrated that individual resistance could catalyze institutional transformation when supported by appropriate legal and policy frameworks. This legislation ensures that future service members won't need to sacrifice their careers to protect institutional integrity. The international impact had been equally significant. Allied militaries had studied the case as an example of how institutional reform could be achieved without compromising military effectiveness. The reforms implemented in response to Admiral Hartwell's conviction had actually enhanced readiness. By improving morale, reducing stress-related medical issues, and creating command climates based on trust rather than fear, Sarah's work with the Veterans Advocacy Organization had expanded to include international consulting with allied militaries, implementing similar reforms. Her expertise in both military culture and institutional change made her particularly effective at bridging the gap between policy intentions and practical implementation, ensuring that reforms produced real cultural transformation rather than superficial compliance. 5 years after the incident, Naval Air Station Meridian hosted an international conference on military leadership and institutional accountability. Sarah was invited as the keynote speaker, an opportunity to address military leaders from throughout NATO about the lessons learned from her experience and the institutional changes that had followed. Institutional reform requires individual courage, she told the assembled officers, but individual courage alone is insufficient. Lasting change demands systematic support for those who speak out, accountability mechanisms that can reach the highest levels of authority, and cultural transformation that values integrity over loyalty to personalities. Her speech emphasized that the changes following Admiral Hartwell's conviction were not the end of struggle, but the beginning of ongoing effort to align institutional practice with stated values. Military effectiveness, she argued, required not just operational competence but moral integrity that extended throughout organizational hierarchies. The conference resulted in NATO-wide adoption of accountability standards based on the reforms implemented after the Admiral Hartwell case. The Meridian Protocols became international benchmarks for addressing institutional harassment and assault, demonstrating that individual resistance could catalyze changes with global implications when supported by appropriate institutional Responses. As Sarah prepared to leave Naval Air Station Meridian after the conference, she paused at the memorial wall that honored personnel who had served with distinction. Her name was not included. The circumstances of her discharge precluded such recognition, but the institutional changes her sacrifice had catalyzed were visible throughout the base and beyond. Master Chief Rodriguez, now Command Master Chief of the fleet, approached for a final conversation. Their relationship had evolved from professional colleagues to advocates for institutional reform, bound together by shared experience of challenging systematic dysfunction despite enormous personal risk. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had helped implement fundamental change throughout the Navy. "5 years ago, you made a choice that changed everything for women in military service. The culture we have now, where harassment gets reported and addressed, where victims get supported instead of silenced, that's your legacy. That's what your sacrifice achieved." Sarah's response reflected the perspective that came from years of advocating for institutional reform while rebuilding her own life in civilian society. "Master Chief, what we achieved, all of us who spoke up despite the personal cost, was the recognition that military service demands loyalty to principles rather than personalities. That's not my legacy alone. It's the legacy of everyone who chose justice over career security." As Sarah drove away from Naval Air Station Meridian for what would likely be the final time, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that afternoon 5 years earlier when Admiral Hartwell had cornered her in the hangar. The base that had once symbolized institutional dysfunction had become a model for reform throughout the military. The culture of silence and retaliation that had protected predatory behavior for generations was being replaced by expectations of accountability that extended to the highest levels of military hierarchy. The personal cost had been enormous: the end of a military career she had loved, the dissolution of her marriage, the challenge of rebuilding identity and purpose in civilian society. But the institutional impact had provided meaning that transformed personal sacrifice into broader social good, proof that individual courage could catalyze changes benefiting countless others who would never know the price that had been paid for their protection. Her daughter, now in college and considering military service herself, had recently asked whether the sacrifice had been worth it. Sarah's answer captured both the personal loss and institutional transformation that had resulted from her moment of resistance. "Sweetheart, what happened that day wasn't about choosing between my career and my principles. It was about recognizing that real military service sometimes requires challenging the very system we serve, that loyalty to the Constitution matters more than loyalty to individual leaders." The story of Sarah Chen and Admiral Hartwell had become more than a case study in military justice. It had become a symbol of the courage required to challenge institutional dysfunction, proof that individual resistance could catalyze systematic reform when supported by appropriate legal and cultural frameworks. The changes that followed demonstrated that institutional transformation was possible even in hierarchical organizations with strong traditions of protecting authority figures. As Sarah began the next chapter of her civilian life, she carried with her the knowledge that her moment of resistance had fundamentally altered the military culture for generations of service members who would follow. The legacy was not her alone, but belonged to everyone who had chosen principle over career security, justice over institutional loyalty, and accountability over the protection of predatory authority. The transformation continued, imperfect but fundamental, a testament to the power of individual courage supported by institutional commitment to genuine reform rather than cosmetic compliance. The culture of silence and retaliation was being replaced by expectations of integrity that extended throughout military hierarchies, ensuring that future Sarah Chens would not need to sacrifice everything to protect the principles that military service was supposed to embody.